Hello, and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we'll travel back in time to the 35th Academy Awards, which awarded the films of 1962. Robert Mulligan was given the task of adapting Harper Lee's Pulitzer Prize-winning book To Kill a Mockingbird to the big screen, and did so with great success. The film received widespread acclaim and was nominated for 8 Oscars, going on to win 3 in total, including Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. But it was the sweeping epic Lawrence of Arabia that took home Best Picture and 6 other awards that night. So why did To Kill a Mockingbird come up short? We'll explore all this and more as we discuss how the Oscar almost went to Kill a Mockingbird. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, and today I have a great returning guest with me who hasn't been on for a little while, actually. First heard this guy talking about Mystic River and the films of 2003. Joined me again for a passage to India and the films of 1984. From Gold Derby, here to talk with me about 1962, Mr. Tony Ruiz.
Yeah, I figure every 20 years or so is a good enough range for me.
Yeah, just check in every 20 years or so.
It's like a high
yeah,
school reunion.
yeah. Looking forward to 1941 next
Oh
time.
boy.
Yeah. So, yes, today we are talking about a big, big film and also a big winner as well. So, this is very exciting. 2 excellent films. The runner-up we're talking about today is To Kill a Mockingbird. So, the film is based on the beloved 1960 novel of the same name by Harper Lee, about a family living in the fictional town of Macomb, Alabama, during the 1930s. And so we meet the young Scout Finch and her brother Jem, who get into hijinks in their neighborhood alongside their friend Dill. And that includes spying on one of their neighbors, the mysterious Boo Radley. And of course, we also meet Atticus Finch, the father of Scout and Jem, who is a lawyer with strong moral values, and he is defending a black man named Tom Robinson, who is on trial after being accused of raping a white woman, Mayella Ewell. And throughout the film, we witness racism and prejudice and kind of the desire to do the right thing in the face of bad situations. And so the film was directed by Robert Mulligan and written by Horton Foote, adapting Harper Lee's novel. And Gregory Peck stars as Atticus Finch, Mary Badham as Scout, Philip Alford as Jem, John Menya as Dill, Brock Peters as Tom, Colin Wilcox, Frank Overton, Rosemary Murphy, Alice Ghostley, and Robert Duvall as Boo Radley. So To Kill a Mockingbird made $13 million at the US box office, was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, winning 3, but not Best Picture. Okay, Tony, so let's talk about this first because you are an English teacher. To Kill a Mockingbird is a book that is clearly kind of part of the standard of what you read in school. You said you've taught it many times. Before we delve into the film itself, I want to actually talk about the enduring legacy of this story in book form, at least. So, what do you think it is about this story that has kind of endured?
I have taught this book a long time, and it is one of those books. We're going through this thing in education where we're looking at novels and assessing their value. And To Kill a Mockingbird is just one of those books that no matter how many times it comes up in conversation, there's never any question that it belongs. And I think part of the reason why, particularly, it's so taught in schools is that even though it is, essentially Atticus Finch is kind of the central character of the book, it is through a child's perspective. And there is this innocence of a child coming of age and starting to see the world around them. And I think that that perspective is why the book still resonates. And especially in an era when racism takes different forms, where we see the dehumanization of people, that goes just beyond white and black. And it's something that parallels. There's so many contemporary parallels for it that it makes it something that's really easy to teach. But I will also say that I don't know a single English teacher who has ever taught this book and not used the film. I mean, it would be sacrilegious to teach this book and not include the film. But it's just one of those books that no matter how many times I read it, no matter how many times I teach it, I always find something new in it. And I teach both ends of the spectrum. I teach both, ninth graders, which is where it's usually taught, and I also teach seniors. And at the end of senior year, I mean, it's always the book that comes up most often.
Wow.
So it's very interesting to see how it has endured.
Definitely. And I also think there's some maturity in the way it handles, these things while also telling it from a kid's perspective that makes it kind of perfect for that age range as well. And dealing with some very complex matters in some simple terms without being like too simplified, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not condescending
Right,
ever.
right. There you go. Right.
It hits that sweet spot where kids are still kids who are growing up.
Exactly. So yeah, let's talk about the film itself and actually whether you feel like you can separate the film as an entity, as a piece of art from the book.
Oh, I think you totally can, because in any adaptation, of particularly of a novel, uh, there's going to be things that are different. There's going to be things that you have to tweak. And so what I find so effective about the film is that even the things that they leave out, there are certain, complexities in the novel that have to be left out. But the film maintains the spirit of the novel, and does so in a way that it doesn't really dilute the novel. It just kind of says, okay, what are the key beats that we have to hit, and how do we maintain the spirit of it? It's such a well done adaptation that, it's a shame that I don't live on the East Coast, because the Aaron Sorkin adaptation is playing on Broadway and is a big hit. And that certainly does expand. It certainly takes certain characters and expands them. But I feel like they can be discussed separately. They're both of a one, and yet you can. I would encourage everybody to read the book. But if you haven't, the movie gives you everything you need.
Yeah. I think the mood of the film is just so poignant, I guess, without ever feeling too sappy or preachy or sentimental in an indulgent sort of way. And I think, Mulligan and Horton Foote have such a strong handle on just like the heart of what the story is. And I think they're able to communicate this weird experience of like being a kid growing up in the South, going up against racism in your everyday life, but not fully grasping all of the history behind it and the social implications and everything. And also just, figuring out what your relationship is with your parent. It has all of those themes in addition to everything with Atticus Finch, which is also obviously the real heart of the film for me. And that is just this portrait of a man who is idealistic in some ways, who, seeing it through the daughter's eyes, we don't necessarily get the biggest portrait of Atticus Finch, but it's still enough where we get a grasp of who this guy really is, of just standing up for what's right in the face of a town that is very much like against his own values in some ways, and how he
Mhm.
tries to sort of manipulate emotions and try to talk in their terms and things like that. There's just so much going on that I think the film is able to really communicate, and just the tone itself. I think it's like it's dignified in a way that, anyone can just watch it and respect it, but also it does touch on a lot of the darkness in this story and isn't afraid to do that. And it doesn't feel to me like a super conventional kind of film, even looking at like the narrative of it, because it has that long trial scene kind of in the middle of what Scout is dealing with. And so there's just so much going on here. I don't know if you want to expand on anything that I just said.
Well, no, but I think we'll talk about this more in detail when we start talking about some of the actual Oscars. But to me, when you think about adapting this, if you know anything about Horton Foote, you know that he is the perfect person to adapt this, because he has that dramatist sense, and also has that kind of, a lot of his most famous stuff has that kind of Southern quality. He also won an Oscar for writing the script to Tender Mercies, ironically, also with Robert Duvall, and also
a film we covered on the show.
And also one of my favorite films, a film that I think gets some slack, that doesn't get the respect it deserves, is Geraldine Page's Oscar-winning The Trip to Bountiful.
Right.
Which Horton Foote, Horton Foote is really a Southern writer in the best sense. And so he's kind of the perfect person to capture, the streets of Macomb and the attitudes of the people, the little details like the ice block in front of the courthouse that people just chip off ice and take it in because there's no air conditioning in the courthouse. Yeah. Just little things like that. It's such a brilliant script.
Yeah, and how everyone is like sweating.
Yeah.
So much. Yeah, I think you really kind of feel the heat of the entire film, really. Yeah, I want to talk about Gregory Peck and his performance. First of all, AFI #1 hero of all time. And that really comes down to his portrayal, I think. And let's talk about the fact that he wins an Oscar for this role, and how it's not necessarily one of those roles where there's a lot of yelling and grandstanding, even though there's obviously a courtroom scene. So there's some speechifying, as we like to say at Gold Derby. But it's not like he ever like raises his voice that much. He is very even keeled throughout this. So do you have any additional thoughts on Gregory Peck's performance here?
There are flashier performances, particularly in this category. But to me, there was no question that this was going to be Gregory Peck's to win. For no other reason than, we talk about this a lot with the Emmys, is that, empathy is one of those big factors. And you cannot help, I don't care how great your relationship is with your own father. I don't care. Your father could be a saint for all I care. Everybody watches To Kill a Mockingbird and goes, I want Gregory Peck to be my dad.
Yes.
You just do. And then he also has that really giant closing argument, which is taken almost verbatim from the novel. I think they maybe cut like one paragraph, but it's done all in one take. He did that in one take, and it's just a masterpiece. So, and he was a very popular winner that year. I show my students sometimes Gregory Peck winning the Oscar, and they're like, the Oscars go all the way back that far? And I was like, yes, things exist before you. But yes. it's both the caring he has, the emotion he has, but there's also these little moments where, like, for example, the look of abject terror on his face when he's in front of Tom Robinson's jail cell and Scout and Jem show up. There's the him standing toe to toe with Bob Ewell.
Yeah.
Him sitting next to Jem at the end of Jem's bed at the end of the film.
Oh yeah.
It's such a beautiful performance. This was his 5th nomination and his last nomination, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And he had done so much good work over the course of. I mean, he had been in a Best Picture winner already with Gentleman's Agreement, and such a tremendous. I mean, it is one of the great screen performances of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, it definitely is. And there was a lot of, kind of comparisons between Gregory Peck himself and Atticus Finch and how he really wanted the film. He really wanted this role. And you can really tell, I think, through his performance that he just pours himself totally into this. And I remember kind of talking about that speech he has, kind of a behind the scenes thing of how, like, the jury actors basically burst into applause after his speech because they were just like blown away, and you can see why. Because yeah, like you said, one take, just that, and the amount of emotions he delivers in that without, like I said, sort of raising his voice too much, just laying out exactly what the jurors need to think about is just so masterful, I think.
Well, yeah, and it's one of those. As we were as I was preparing for this, I was looking at some things, some of the obituaries of Gregory Peck, and a lot of people say that Atticus Finch really just was Gregory Peck, and and I almost feel that that's almost a little bit reductive, um, because yeah, I'm sure there were elements of Atticus Finch that were part of Gregory Peck, but it also, I think, it reduces, I think, the technique, the craft that he has,
That's true.
because it's not just him saying the words. I mean, he gives a performance. It's not a flashy performance, it's not a big performance, but it is a performance. And so it's almost like what comes first, Atticus Finch or Gregory Peck, because it is the role that he became the most known for, and he was thrilled about that. He loved that, and
Yeah,
it
why
also
wouldn't
didn't
you be?
and it also didn't stop him from um, doing. It wasn't like his last film or anything. He did everything from The Omen to,
Yeah.
I remember, Moby Dick, which is one of my favorite movies. Um,
And the film we just talked about on the show, How the West Was Won.
oh yes, oh
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. You can see why he would love to be associated with Atticus Finch, obviously, but yeah, it's a stellar performance. And I think about the scene where, like you were saying, he's facing off against Yule, and it's, for some reason, every time I watch that, I get emotional, just kind of watching all of the emotions flash through him, and you almost think he's going to, like, punch back or spit in his face, but he obviously just wipes away the spit and just kind of walks on. There's just so much going on in that one scene that I just am always kind of moved by.
It's just one of the great screen performances. I just can't say that enough.
Yeah. Well, speaking of other performances, we have Mary Badham, who is the other person who gets nominated here, playing Scout. What do we think of this performance? And also, do we think it's a lead, even though she's in supporting?
You know, I there are some cases where I get irritated about category placement. This is not necessarily one of them. Um, First of all, Mary Badham, hadn't acted before,
Yeah.
uh, and uh, it's hard to say whether she deserves that nomination or not, because I think she's really just she's playing this part, but she is. It's hard to separate her from the character. And she didn't really do much after this. I think she's actually she works in college admissions and stuff like that, college testing or something now. But her and Gregory Peck really did form a bond like that lasted throughout their lives. Um, I read an interview where she said that every time she saw him, she just called him Atticus. Um, but it's one of those kid performances that is so spot on. What she does capture, I think, really well is Scout's fieriness.
Mm.
The impatience, the bursts of temper. Um, it is kind of funny that even some of my seniors, when we're talking about the book, the first thing they'll immediately say is they'll go, Jim. They'll imitate her. The fact that she was, beaten in this category by another juvenile
Yeah.
performance says something to it. But it's a great child performance. I don't know that I would necessarily nominate it, but if there was going to be one of the children nominated, it was going to be her.
Yeah, I don't totally love the performance in a way that I think she should have won by any means, but I do think she more than occupies what this character is and communicates this sense of her kind of being a little bit of a tomboyish kind of character who doesn't necessarily want to fit in with all the sort of feminine things around her that are trying to mold her into this southern genteel woman. That
Oh,
sort
the
of thing.
scene of her coming out on the first day of school in that dress.
Yeah.
The look of absolute horror on
That's what I
her
mean.
face.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So she's able to do that well. And it's hard for me to say because I mean, well, it is kind of told from her perspective. We get the narration from the future with I believe that's Kim Stanley narrating that
Yeah.
as Scout, and she sounds a little bit more of that sort of genteel kind of Southern woman by older age than we necessarily see in the film. But I think it's sort of a lead, but also I can sort of see why, because Atticus Finch casts such a large shadow that there's no one else that could really be a lead in this film. So yeah, let's talk about the trial here because that is for me one of the most gripping scenes in cinema history, dare I
Oh
say,
yeah.
where it's just you just feel the suspense, you feel the sweat, you feel that anything could happen, and you can see how Atticus Finch is so in control of the situation. And it's again going back to AFI, rated #1 courtroom drama of all time, and you
Yeah,
can see why in this one scene.
and what's interesting is that, and I think this is a credit to both the way Horton Foote adapted the courtroom scene and the way that Mulligan shot it, is that this is a courtroom scene that has suspense, even if you've never read the book, you know how it's going to turn out. Only the most naive viewer would think that this is going to turn out well. But it is. I absolutely love the courtroom scene. Because you have all these great character actors. Brock Peters is Tom Robinson.
So good.
Star Trek nerds like me know Brock Peters from the Star Trek films of the 80s. And so I remember when I was in school, when I was in high school, and I read this book for the first time. We watched the movie, and nerd me was like, "Oh my god, it's Admiral Cartwright from the Star Trek movies! Wow, that's pretty cool."
Yeah.
But and then you have William Wyndham, the great William Wyndham, as the prosecutor. That perfect blend of uh, Southern condescension, like, "Oh look,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Southern gentleman," but especially when he's cross-examining Tom, just this kind of viper-like
Yeah.
superiority, so great.
It's slimy.
Yeah, and of course, we have to talk about Bob, of course, but we really have to talk about Mayella Ewell.
Colin Wilcox.
Wow.
Yeah. The fact that she doesn't get a nomination, I think, is a big oversight.
Yeah, and especially since it's the kind of performance. I mean, she's really just in that one scene. It's kind of like a Viola Davis in Doubt sort of situation.
Yeah.
But I mean, she's harrowing to watch, and just has this kind of just damaged look on her face. It's just heartbreaking. But the whole trial scene is just so wonderful. And then, of course, you have the kids up in the balcony where all the black people are sitting, and them standing as Atticus walks out. It's so beautifully done.
Yeah.
and
And
not ruined with an over melodramatic musical underscore.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It's that they really could have played that wrong, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, credit to them for really capturing kind of the melancholy tone of the entire film. So let's talk about the handling of the sort of mystery of Boo Radley here, played by Robert Duvall in his debut role at the very end of the film. I thought that sort of mystery, the lingering thing, was so accurate to just being a kid and like having like your local legends who like you all sort of conspire about and talk about and like, ooh, who's in that house, and you kind of make up stories, that whole thing.
Oh
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
we all do that. We all totally do that.
yes.
I remember growing up, we had a house 3 doors down from us that was this dark, kind of dark wood house. I don't think I ever saw anybody come in and out of there. But you knew somebody lived there, and we just used to just kind of walk by that house and then go across the street whenever we walked in front of it, because we were like, especially at Halloween time, that house never had trick-or-treaters go to it. And we were just like, I wonder who lives there. And you just make up all these stories and stuff
Exactly.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's really great. But yeah, definitely the way things sort of conclude with that storyline, I think you could say if this was handled wrong, if the book was handled wrong, if the movie was handled wrong, it would be sort of convenient, sort of act three thing to tie things together. But I think it's really well handled, that final act.
What's interesting is in the book, after Jem is brought home with the broken arm, and Bob Yule is dead. In the book, Atticus genuinely believes at first that Jem was the one that did it,
Mm-hmm.
and is trying to convince the sheriff, who has one of the greatest names ever, Heck Tate. I love that.
Yes.
Love that. Only in the South can you have a name like Heck.
Heck
Um,
Tate. Yeah.
um, and I almost kind of wish that they had played that up a little more, but it wouldn't really. I didn't. I thought the way that they kind of condensed that in the film
Mm-hmm.
is much easier, because it is really about, you have that thread of, why the book is called To Kill a Mockingbird. It's Tom Robinson and Boo Radley are just kind of one and the same. They're both kind of people who are victims of their circumstances, but who aren't actively doing anything that should bring trouble upon them. So it's so well done, and even though Duvall doesn't utter a sound, um, it's such a it. You're just like, oh, of course, that's of course what Boo Radley looks like.
Yeah. It's really, I think, one of those things where I'm sure, reading the book, you get an idea in your mind of what he might look like, but it can be hard to actually show that on the screen without people being like disappointed or being like, well, that's not my Boo Radley.
No,
And
I'm pretty sure Robert Duvall is everybody's Boo Radley.
there you go. Yeah. So I think the way they kind of make him up, his appearance it's just so haunted, and his performance, even if he's like you said, he doesn't say a word, he still manages to communicate kind of this reclusive guy who doesn't really talk to people. It's haunting stuff. I want to talk about some of the formal elements of the film. I think the score by Elmer Bernstein is so great. And it's also very layered as well. It has like the playfulness and the innocence with the childhood stuff, but also, as we move along and we start to see some of the universal life lessons and everything sprinkled in, I think becomes very melodic and really beautiful. And
I love the score. I mean, certain films, and we'll talk about this also with Lawrence of Arabia.
yeah,
There are certain, sometimes a film, like I'm talking about like Forrest Gump and Jaws, and films where you hear the melody hear one melody and you know exactly what movie it is.
mhm,
I hear those opening that kind of string part of the theme of To Kill a Mockingbird, I know exactly what it is.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful,
And it paints a picture in your mind too.
yeah, you get kind of that innocent, childlike, almost fantasy sort of element to it. And Elmer Bernstein um, was just one of those composers that you're like, he only has one Oscar? What?
I know. Yeah. And in another year, I think this probably would have won.
I think so.
But, they went up against the buzzsaw of Lawrence of Arabia. So it's hard to win in that situation. But
Yeah.
also the cinematography is really fantastic. I think it really, even though it's like this small town thing and it feels like it's very, low budget, it still is able to really communicate the mood of the film. And, thinking about if this film was in color, I do think they made the right choice to go with black and white, personally speaking. I think it creates a really interesting sort of timeless quality to this film.
And this is back when they were giving Oscars for both black and white
Right.
cinematography and color cinematography. And, uh, you know, it just drives me crazy. It's still one of my biggest pet peeves to this day when somebody says, "Oh, I don't want to watch that movie. It's in black and white." I'm like, out. Goodbye. Um, yeah, but yeah, it does capture, and I think it goes back to the courtroom scene with the heat, or moving to like kind of the creepiness of Bob Ewell. It's all captured so beautifully
Mm-hmm.
in that kind of, it's very textured, even though it's black and white. People don't think that black and white films can be textured, but they certainly can be.
Yeah.
Um,
And this is proof. Yeah. And it's
yeah,
shadowy in really interesting ways that makes it feel a little more menacing.
when it needs to be, and it also is, that kind of. It also has that kind of light. I mean, the film opens on such a light-hearted tone
Mm-hmm.
that you can it's almost idyllic, and we don't think of black and white as being idyllic. Um,
Right.
so I
And
love
if
it.
it kind of feels like a memory of the lost time in the beginning there,
Mm-hmm.
especially, with the narration and everything. So yeah, it's just really well put together, even on a small budget. I think, it just is competing with the best of them with the resources they had. It's it's beautiful filmmaking, really, from the story level to all of those formal elements. If I had one negative, I would say, about the film, it's that I don't know if there's a great balance between the white and black communities. I think it is one sided and it can feel very white saviory sometimes in that way, but I do understand, it's told from the point of view of Scout, and so there's only so much you can do. But I think there might have been some opportunities missed that could have painted like a more detailed picture, essentially, of kind of the tensions between these two communities. I don't know if you
Yeah,
would agree on that.
it's interesting because again, this is, I think, part of where the change from the novel to the to the screen. There are more scenes like that in the book,
Yeah.
like where Jem and Scout go to Calpurnia's church, and so yeah, I think I think that if this film were made today, I think you'd probably see more of that. Um, but I don't know that for 1962, for this film, I think this does as good of a balance as it can do in that time period. So I'm willing to cut it a little slack for that time period. I mean, there's
Yeah.
equally problematic stuff in Lawrence of Arabia, which we'll get to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, and I do like that. I do like that Calpurnia is still a factor. If I had a critique of the film, it would be that Calpurnia seems more fleshed out in the book than she comes across in the film.
That is certainly true.
I would love to see more of that, but again, you take it with the time.
Yeah, I think it's well intentioned and working within the means of its time period for sure.
Yeah.
Uh, but Yeah, and it's not like I would ever want to see like a sort of remake of this story by any means, because I think this is so definitive that there's no reason to really remake it.
Yeah, take a note, Disney. Don't remake this.
Good God. Well, I was reading that Walt Disney himself really loved the film, but
Yeah,
that's neither
well,
here nor there.
that's
um,
that's enough material for another podcast.
yes, good Lord. Do you have any additional thoughts on this film before we talk about the Oscars?
No, let's talk about the Oscars.
Okay, great. I'll just wrap up and say this is a beautiful film. Just by the end of it, I just feel so emotional in so many ways. It's like it's heavy, but it's also cathartic, and it just leaves you thinking about the state of things. And I think it still resonates almost 60 years later. So
And it's still in for my money. It is just such. It's as good of a book to film adaptation as one could hope for.
yeah,
The only way that it could be better is if you turned it into a limited series. Don't do that.
good God. Yeah.
But and again, it comes back to Gregory Peck.
Gregory Peck. Absolutely. Ooh. So when we come back, we'll be discussing why To Kill a Mockingbird lost Best Picture to Lawrence of Arabia.
The world never seems as fresh and wonderful, as comforting and terrifying, as good and evil, as it does when seen through the eyes of a child. For a writer to capture that feeling is remarkable. And perhaps that is why one book in the last few years has been so warmly embraced by tens of millions of people. To Kill a Mockingbird, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and just about every other award a book can win. And now, happily, To Kill a Mockingbird becomes a motion picture, and its memorable characters come vividly alive. That Scout. Some people call her Jean Louise Finch, but she insists on Scout. And that's her brother, Jim. Just a boy until the day he learns there is evil in the world. And Atticus Finch, the father, whose devotion to justice places him and his children in jeopardy. I've been appointed to defend Tom Robinson. Now that he's been charged, that's what I intend to do.
You taking his
You'll excuse me, Mr. Ewell.
What kind of man are you? You got children of your own?
Atticus, Jim says this watch is going to belong to him someday.
That's right.
What are you going to give me?
There's a pearl necklace. There's a ring that belonged to your mother. You want to tell us what really happened?
I got something to say. And if you ain't gonna do nothing about it, then you're just a bunch of lousy, yellow, stinking cowards.
And we're back. So now we'll be discussing why To Kill a Mockingbird lost Best Picture to Lawrence of Arabia. To Kill a Mockingbird was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Robert Mulligan, Best Actor for Gregory Peck, Best Supporting Actress for Mary Badham, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Black and White, Best Cinematography, Black and White, and Best Original Score, and it won 3 of them for Best Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Art Direction. Before the Oscars, To Kill a Mockingbird only really won the WGA for major precursors, while Lawrence of Arabia won everything else, as to be expected, including the Golden Globe, the DGA, and BAFTA. So more or less a sweep with precursors of that time, at least. So yes, let's talk about, I feel like it's a little bit obvious in this case, but let's talk about why Lawrence of Arabia ultimately wins over To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Lawrence of Arabia is that on paper, even before you even see the film, just on paper, you know that this is going to be the dominant film because, you know, you've got David Lean fresh off the Bridge on the River Kwai Oscar win. You've got this long, hulking epic, exotic locations. But then you actually watch Lawrence of Arabia, And you realize that this is one of the masterpieces of cinema. I mean, so much so that, I mean, Scorsese and Spielberg have both said that this is one of the defining films of their lives. And it also is one of those films that really is very different in that when you look at these kind of historical epics that we had seen previous, there is kind of this heroic character at the center. But T. Lawrence, as played by Peter O'Toole, is not your typical kind of epic hero lead. He is bombastic. He is egocentric. He is flawed. He is a
He buys into his own hype.
He totally buys into his own hype.
Yeah.
And so having such a character like that as the anchor for your film really was quite groundbreaking at the time, because he was not, I mean, this is what, 3 years after Ben-Hur? This was a very different type of leading performance in this type of film. I mean, and then you look at just the craft alone. We've talked about David Lean. I've talked about David Lean on this show.
You personally have talked about David Lean.
I personally have done my homework on David Lean.
Yeah.
And this was a film that did not skimp on anything. This is a film that had something like 280 some odd shooting days. That almost never happens now.
Yeah.
I think I read an interview with Spielberg that said that if this film were made today, the same way that David Lean made it, it would probably cost about $300 million to make.
Yeah, you could see that. Yeah.
And no studio would do it, and they'd resort to doing everything digitally. And what's so beautiful about this film, and I've seen this film probably 10 times. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. One of the things I love about it is that it's all practical. It's all practical effects. There's no like special effects or anything, and you just ask yourself what they must have had to do to pull off some of these shots. I mean, I'm thinking of the Mirage, the Mirage shot of Omar Sharif kind of coming in. It's one of my favorite shots in all of cinema, one of many. But yeah, this. When you look at a film like this, you just go, yeah, that has Oscar written all over it. I think this is the film that The English Patient thought it was.
Yeah. Pretty much. I think that's.
And I'm like, no, you just, thank you, next.
You tried it. Yeah.
Bless your heart.
Good for you. Yeah. I mean, I don't hate The English Patient, but yeah, it's definitely a pale imitation in some ways of the scope and the kind of story that Lawrence of Arabia is trying to tell. And it is such a complex, heroic story. Like you were saying, it's very much an atypical, almost anti-hero-ish sort of character. Not totally, obviously, but just Peter O'Toole plays him with such complexity that you can see the sort of charisma that he has, and you can see how so many people would be drawn to him. But you can also see how that could also turn him into someone who believes his own hype. And it's such a fascinating journey to watch throughout, and always keeps me engaged, even if it's 3.5 hours.
Right.
It is a big commitment, but I think that performance is standing the test of time. And obviously all of the sweeping locales with the beautiful desert backdrops continue to hold up today. And it's just one of the most beautifully shot films ever made. And so it has all of these different aspects to it that are very clearly in the Academy's wheelhouse of this is what Best Picture is. It's not these small scale kinds of films at all. And we see that even in the other nominees, how there's very much this mindset of the big, grand studio films that are Best Picture worthy.
Right.
And so as great as To Kill a Mockingbird is, it was just never going to be in that conversation. Even though it is a runner-up here, And there was a lot of support, I would imagine, behind this film, and there was a lot of heart and a lot of goodwill for it. It just was not ever going to compare to this mammoth film here.
I think also, I think given it, if it had been maybe, I think if it had been like 61 or 63, then it might have, maybe would have stood, more of a chance.
Yeah.
But it's always hard to tell.
Yeah. I was just thinking of it by the end of watching To Kill a Mockingbird again for this week, is that I think if this had come out in 1963, that it would have beaten Tom Jones.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame when things happen like this, where it's almost similar to what I was talking about on the 1972 episode, where Cabaret wins 8 Oscars, but it happens to be in the same year as The Godfather. And if it come out in 1973, it maybe would have beaten The Sting. So.
Well, I mean, we're still having those conversations.
I know.
I don't think we'll ever stop having those conversations.
No, this is what this entire podcast is about, really. So you're in the right place. Well, let's just get to a few questions before we talk about some of these other nominees. From Andrew Carden, who said, Mary Badham in To Kill a Mockingbird and Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker, lead or supporting? And if either was pushed lead, would they have been nominated?
If they'd been pushed lead, I don't think either one of them would have been nominated. I think that Patty Duke is more supporting than Mary Badham is.
Yeah.
Even though, the story is, the miracle worker of the title is Anne Bancroft.
Right.
But it really is. I still stand by the placement of Patty Duke in supporting. I don't. Lead actress was such a, very competitive year that year for reasons which you can ask Ryan Murphy about. And
yes. More on that later.
More on that later.
Yes.
But yeah, I think if Mary Badham had been pushed lead, no, she wouldn't have gotten nominated.
Agreed.
I don't think Patty Duke would have either, although I'm more comfortable with Patty Duke in supporting than I am with Mary Badham in supporting.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's a little complicated, but I see what you're saying there.
Yeah.
I do think actually if Patty Duke had campaigned in lead, that there might have been a chance that she could have gotten in, based on the sheer fact that she wins, of course. But also it's just such a compelling character and a historical figure. All of that sort of thing tends to help, but also, actresses of that age just were never going to be in Best Actress. And often the case we see even today, how something like Jacob Tremblay is campaigned in supporting, despite the fact that he's very clearly a lead in that film. Things like that. I don't know if that rule will ever change. And there's only a few exceptions, like Convention Wallace, I think, is the big one there. But yeah. Regardless, I'm on a tangent.
Or Keisha Castle Hughes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, we got a question from someone who used to go by the name Glenda Miss Jackson If You Nasty. But
yes.
Now he has changed his name, Kyle Bailey, I'm talking about, to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. After Marianne Williamson.
Okay,
yes,
then.
Just go with it. He said, do you think Mockingbird was robbed of more supporting nominations? Brock Peters and Colin Wilcox were my favorites. And I agree with him on that.
I agree with him wholeheartedly.
I would say that they both should have gotten in. Yeah.
Yeah. Bravo.
Good job. Yes. Yeah, and I think either one of them could have contended for a win for me.
Ironically, particularly with Colin Wilcox, when you look at that lineup of Best Supporting Actress, I think honestly the only person who you could maybe remove would be Mary Badham.
Yeah.
Because I can't see any of the other 4 not getting in.
This is true. She would have replaced a co-star for sure. Yeah. You do what you can. Going to Lawrence of Arabia, we got this question from San Diego Cinerama, who said, a question that we've been talking about a lot on this podcast for a while now, which is how come Peter O'Toole never won an Oscar?
I blame his lack of an Oscar squarely on the shoulders of Cliff Robertson.
Yes.
Actually, more on Cliff Robertson's wife, but that's a whole long other story. Just research Cliff Robertson and Charlie and his Oscar win, and you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That, to me, I mean, I could totally see this as being a competitive race between O'Toole and Peck, but I can't go against Peck on this one. That performance is just so iconic. It's just one of those performances that is, when you think of a great acting performance, you think of Gregory Peck. Now, Peter O'Toole was not as well known here at the time.
Right. It was introducing Peter O'Toole in the film.
So, and with Peck on his 5th nomination, I think this is the type of performance that should have made O'Toole the front runner. Is like, okay, you're welcome to the club. The next time you'll get it. But then that
just
never
kept happening, right? And then it never
Yeah.
did. Yeah, we talked about it on the Lion in Winter episode about that whole thing with Robertson and everything. But also, I was my guest on that was Amy Thomason, and she mentioned that something interesting, and her theory is that whoever was playing Atticus Finch was going to win that Oscar. What do you think of that?
Well, it's interesting. From a retrospective perspective, maybe, but you have to keep in mind, the book came out in what, 1960, and the movie came out in 1962. So, we, mostly thanks to the film, but also thanks to the book, we have almost 60 years of this character and this ideal which Peck created of Atticus Finch, that did the populace at large. I doubt that they had that only 2 years after the book came out. So was it going to happen? Probably, because the book is written that way, with Atticus being that way. It goes back to the paradox of what comes first, Gregory Peck or Atticus Finch.
Yeah.
Because the two are so enmeshed in our minds.
Right. That's a very good point. It's hard to really even separate them at all.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you're gonna say just in a vacuum, if an actor like, say, Rock Hudson, who was kind of in the mix to play him as at one point, if he had given the same caliber of performance, would he have won? I think the answer is probably yes.
Probably.
Yeah. But again, it's just so hard to separate the two. Having said that,
Peter O'Toole,
amazing. Yeah.
Yes, Peter O'Toole is amazing, and I still, we always talk about the Oscar wins we'll never forgive, and everybody always brings up, Judy Garland or this or that or that. I always go back to Peter O'Toole in The Lion in Winter.
Yeah,
it's one of my all-time favorite films and one of my all-time favorite performances.
It's so good. And the fact that he couldn't even win for that was just proof that, like, this is never going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we've gone over this over and over on the show. So, yeah. But this was from Eric Maxwell Broods, who said, do you think Peter O'Toole deserved to win Best Actor? It's hard for me because Peck's performance is iconic, but O'Toole is so captivating in every scene. I agree with that. It's one of those cases where, once again, going back to the movies being in the same year, I almost wonder if, Peter O'Toole hadn't been going up against everything that people feel about Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch, that he could have won.
Yeah, I have to say, as much as I love Peter O'Toole and I love Lawrence of Arabia, I still go to Peck on this one.
Yeah.
If Peck had already won before, I would be more comfortable saying, sure, Peter O'Toole. But just based on performance alone, I gotta go with Peck.
Yeah. In my sort of alternate history, I would just have awarded O'Toole for The Lion in Winter and just have that be that, and have
Yeah.
Gregory Peck have this, and both parties are satisfied.
Yep.
Yeah. Kel Loves Movies said, why was Anthony Quinn campaigned as lead for Lawrence of Arabia? Was it because he was a bigger star at the time than O'Toole?
Quite possibly. I mean, he was in many ways, he was on a kind of a roll at that time. I think I think there's a lot of ways, but I don't know what you would be thinking though, because the movie is called Lawrence of Arabia. it's not it's not called whatever the hell. I'm blanking on what the character was that Anthony Quinn played.
Yeah,
I can never
Auda
remember his
Abu
name.
Tai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. No, that makes no sense to me. It was
Yeah.
probably just because Quinn was kind of a big star at that point.
Well, I think that's part of it.
But
Yeah.
then at the same token, so was Alec Guinness.
Yeah.
I mean, hell, Alec Guinness had an Oscar at that point.
Right. I don't know. Sometimes there's just ego involved, to be honest.
In Hollywood, no.
Sorry to spill some industry secrets. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other Best Picture nominees. Really interesting situation we have this year because, as you mentioned to me before we chatted, the other 3 Best Picture nominees were not nominated for any of its actors. It was not nominated for director, and none of them were nominated for writing. So Best Picture was their only above the line nomination, which is just so bizarre. And
it is.
Never happens. And so, yeah, literally Lawrence of Arabia and To Kill a Mockingbird are the only films represented throughout the rest of the above the line nominations. So
yeah. So I mean, you have The Longest Day, which was I've never seen the Longest Day. But to me, just reading about it, it kind of strikes me as kind of like, those Gary Marshall movies like Valentine's Day and New Year's Day. It's like,
yeah.
let's throw every actor into this big war epic and get an Oscar nomination. The problem is that even though it was the highest grossing film of the year, it also cost $30 million to make, which in modern day would be like 150 million, and it still was a bomb. Yeah. Even though it was the highest grossing film of the year, it was still a bomb because of how much money it lost.
Yes, like Cleopatra. Yep.
Like Cleopatra. And then you have Mutiny on the Bounty.
Another film that went over budget.
It went over budget because, let's see, Marlon Brando gives the most bizarre performance I've ever seen.
It's truly, I was going to say, like, I don't know what's happening with that. And it did not surprise me in the slightest to read about the behind the scenes and how he just like took that character and ran with it and just did his own thing.
I read, because I have seen that Mutiny on the Bounty. I've seen all of the film versions of Mutiny on the Bounty. And it's a rare feat when you feel more sorry for the sadistic captain than you do for the person that's leading the mutiny.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, well, no wonder Captain Bligh just wants him gone, because I want him gone too.
Yeah, I am sympathizing with you in this moment.
And I'm not supposed to do that.
Right.
And then you have The Music Man, which is, one of the most beloved Broadway musicals of all time. And they smartly kept Robert Preston, who is so identified with the role of Harold Hill. It's a big, splashy, eye-popping color musical.
Right.
Which also got some below-the-line love in some of the tech stuff. It also won for they used to have a category for best musical adaptation
score, right?
Yeah. So
yep.
an interesting best picture lineup. When we're talking about what could have been in here, holy crap,
there's so many. Yeah. But before we get into those, I will say The Music Man for me is far and away the best of these other three.
Yes.
Which, it's hard not to say that, honestly, between all of these. I would say well, first of all, for The Longest Day, I would maybe say instead of like a Gary Marshall film, I would compare it more to like just essentially Dunkirk, where it's one of these things where there's so many different actors, you're following so many characters, and there's not like one clear story throughout or this one like, narrative of this group of people you're following. It's just like all of the different players involved, and it's like almost like a historical reenactment more than a narrative film.
Yeah.
It's also 3 hours. So there's that. Not necessarily one of my favorites, but certainly very handsomely crafted and all of that. But Mutiny on the Bounty, I just cannot. I can't.
I don't understand it. I really don't. I mean, the film wasn't even. I mean, critics really did not like this film.
I know, yeah, and I was
don't
reading
know
about
how
how
it
like
got
the producers
nominated.
were a little bit surprised that they were even nominated. Yeah, let me see. I actually wrote this down from Inside Oscar. There was someone, let's see, Murray Schumacher of the New York Times was writing about the fact that The Music Man, The Longest Day, and Mutiny on the Bounty were nominated for Best Picture, but none of these other categories. And he said, vote swapping of outrageous proportions is indicated by this year's Oscar nominations for Best Picture. Undercover politics of Oscar campaigning combined with lavish advertising and publicity may make it almost impossible for any movie to be nominated for Best Film in the future unless it is distributed by the major companies.
Oh, how times have changed.
Yeah, exactly. But there's also, it goes on to explain how like some people resented the fact that the idea that you could suggest that there is underhanded campaigning, but there was, so deal with it. Okay, so any other thoughts on this Best Picture lineup before we go into other great movies that are more interesting?
No, it's sad because 62 was such a great year for movies, and if you look at everywhere other than the Best Picture category,
Yep,
there are brilliant films in this, and it's like it's one of the most deflating Best Picture categories I can recall.
it is. Other than those top two, it's just like, oh boy,
Yeah,
drops off after that. Yeah. But yeah, let's get into these other nominees, but not in Best Picture. Should have been a contender where we talk about other movies not nominated for Best Picture or any other movie that came out in 1962. So, Tony, what is at the top of your list?
The top of my list is so difficult. It was I literally had 15 titles that I wrote down.
Right.
That I wrote down because I was like, oh, this could be this, yes, this. At the end of the day, I come back to The Miracle Worker.
Which should be nominated, I think.
It's in that same vein as To Kill a Mockingbird in terms of it's, a big part of the school curriculum, and I remember watching it for the first time in 8th grade and going, how did they do that whole scene in the dining room?
Yeah.
So The Miracle Worker is probably at the top of my list, but what's at the top of your list?
Well, again, it is hard, like you were saying, to pick a total number one from this list because I love a lot of these movies. The one that just always sticks out to me from this year, and it's not necessarily because it's the best film in the world, but just because of everything around it, is Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Yes.
I mean, yes, like you were saying, Ryan Murphy made a whole damn series about it. Feud, Betty and Joan, which was very good. Kind of about the behind the scenes of their feud and also their making of this film. But talking about the film itself, a camp classic if there ever was one. Just
Right.
two aging biddies, two legendary actresses, Oscar-winning actresses going at it, and also having the real life component as well of them not getting along. There's just so much happening there. But also on a story level, I just love kind of conceptually what the film is and how it kind of created more or less a certain genre of sort of the old biddy horror sort of thing. I love it.
Yeah.
And
And
Betty Davis is legendary in this film
oh
for me.
yeah, it's a genre that, for a while, particularly in, I'd say, the late 80s and up through the mid 90s, it's a genre that was really, really popular, of kind of the psychopathic female, that I guess you can start with Fatal Attraction, and going all the way up to, like, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle and Single White Female, and all those types of films. It is such a great, I think they were going, I don't know if they understood at the time that because Baby Jane is one of those films that walks the line between campiness and true horror.
Yeah.
Because it can easily go so wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But no, you're absolutely right. I love that film.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. And also just the amount of commitment that Betty Davis has to that role, and even the sort of the makeup, the garishness of everything. It's just so striking and memorable for me. Oof.
But you are, Blanche, you are.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, this was from Jeffrey Kerr, who said, would you mind talking about the feud that went on between Joan Crawford and Betty Davis during this particular Oscar season?
Oh boy.
So we know about this, how Joan Crawford famously not nominated for this film. Betty Davis is nominated. Some of these other actresses said they weren't going to be at the Oscars in case they won, like including Anne Bancroft. And so Joan Crawford offered to accept the award on their behalf, and essentially kind of upstaging Betty Davis's moment.
And of course, and the series feud portrays this of Crawford actively campaigning, soliciting other Academy members to vote against Betty Davis. Now, how much of that is true and how much isn't is whatever. The point is, I have to say, no matter what was going on behind the scenes, I don't know that necessarily it would have changed anything. I'm not sure that, because the series makes it seem like, because of Joan Crawford's machinations behind the scenes, that's what led to Anne Bancroft winning.
Right.
And I think Anne Bancroft was probably going to win anyway.
I agree. Yeah.
And in a really amazing category. I mean, the series makes it seem like Betty Davis was like the only other option, and wrong.
Exactly.
And that kind of brings me to one of my other should have been a contenders, which is the film adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, which is my all-time favorite play. I have read that thing backwards and forwards. Probably I've seen 7 productions of it. I love that play so much, and I think that Katharine Hepburn's performance is one of her best performances as Mary Tyrone. I absolutely just adore that film.
And speaking of feud, Betty and Joan, we had Jessica Lange, who played Joan Crawford, going on to later play Mary Tyrone on Broadway.
Yeah.
Just an interesting little coincidence there. I haven't seen Long Day's Journey into Night, this production, but I hear great things about her. Yeah.
Well, it is very much a filmed play. I mean, of course, the play is all set in this one house, so it has that kind of stagey quality, which a lot of people don't like. I love it. I don't care. It's not their fault. But I mean, you've got Ralph Richardson and Hepburn and Jason Robards, who originated the role of Jamie Tyrone, and Dean Stockwell, just all firing on all cylinders. It's and you've got Sidney Lumet directing. It's just a devastating 2.5 hours,
Fun.
which is funny because it's a 4-hour play, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, I guess speaking of this category, while we're at it, I want to talk about Days of Wine and Roses
Yes.
because that is a film I had never seen until this week. I, yeah, I,
Oh, really?
yeah, this was one that I knew was notable, and I knew that I would probably like it, but I just never gotten around to it. Yada yada yada. I love this film. I thought it was, I mean, just the depths that Jack Lemmon and Lee Remick go to in this film are just insane to me. It's a very committed performance on both ends. And it's
Oh,
just
yeah.
this deep dive
It's one
into
of
like
my
alcoholism and all the psychological implications of everything. It's so heavy.
it's one of my absolute favorite. It's a great. It's one of my favorite Jack Lemmon performances.
Yeah.
Um, and actually, to go back to a question that was asked earlier, um, if we're talking about the difference between Peter O'Toole and Gregory Peck, I think the alternative to Gregory Peck is not Peter O'Toole. I think the alternative is Jack Lemmon.
Mm,
I think he's so good in this film, and it really is a breakout for Jack Lemmon, who had been known prior to that for mostly doing kind of more lighthearted kind of comedies and things like that, and really showed his depths as a dramatic actor. I mean,
yeah.
that scene in the greenhouse is just devastating. And the fact that the film was directed by Blake Edwards, who was known for comedies like The Pink Panther and stuff like that. So a really, really, I mean, and we haven't even gotten to some of the other films that I could put in this list.
Yeah. Super, super underrated film that I think more people should see. It's really, really powerful stuff. I will also add in Divorce Italian Style, which is
Which I have never seen.
well, it is a fun little romp about a man who wants to murder his wife. But it is a comedy. It is a comedy, to be clear.
So it's like Reversal of Fortune, the
Yes.
Cosmo Mangiolo story, but as a comedy.
Yes, and
Got it.
in Italy. Yes.
Got it.
Yes. It's one of these films that I think probably wouldn't work today, but kind of the fantasy sequences of the things he wants to do to his wife, including just like have her be buried in sand, is really quite striking and fun to watch. Kind of in this, also in this like arty Italian film. It's very fun. Very fun movie. And also Marcello Mastroianni is nominated for Best Actor here as well, and he's really great. Very good comedic timing. And that's also one of those films that gets nominated for Best Director in place of a
Yes.
Best Picture nominee, including The Miracle Worker as well. Yeah, and speaking of international foreign language films, I wanted to mention an Agnes Varda film, very well known from this year, which is Cleo from 5 to 7.
Oh,
Yes. And so this is a great French New Wave film, one of Agnes Varda's most well-known films, clearly. But really beautiful, another really beautiful kind of human condition sort of story in this year about a woman who finds out that she has cancer and kind of is struggling to go about her day. Really just a very simple story, but speaks to a lot of really powerful truths about life. So, do you have others here?
I have three that are more. Well, first of all, The Manchurian Candidate.
Yes.
With the great Angela Lansbury, who, if this had been any other year, she would have won.
Yeah.
I love The Manchurian Candidate, and it continues to remind me that Frank Sinatra is a much more nuanced and underrated actor than I think, even though he has an Oscar. I still don't think enough people appreciate Sinatra as an actor. If you've never seen The Man with the Golden Arm, then you need to. So there's that. I have a soft spot for Westerns because of my grandfather.
Before you go into that, I want to just quickly get a few questions from a Manchurian Candidate before we go to that. This was from Alec Reyna, who said, any thoughts or speculation on why the Manchurian Candidate received such little love by the Academy?
Maybe a little too, it's funny. Now the Manchurian Candidate almost kind of seems like a documentary.
Hey.
I think the Manchurian Candidate was actually kind of ahead of its time.
Yeah.
In terms of that type of, and I don't think, that kind of political thriller in the early 1960s, that is a film that I think if it had been released more in like the mid to late 70s,
oh, for sure,
would have probably resonated a little bit more. I think we were still kind of in this kind of post 1950s, kind of like the golden age of Hollywood sort of time period, and I think it was almost probably maybe too gritty.
Yeah.
For Academy audiences at that point.
I think that's exactly right, and I think it's a type of film. It's chilly. It's a thriller. It doesn't have like these warm people that you can necessarily embrace. Like it's a lot more cerebral than it is something that you feel from your heart, if that makes sense. I just want to add real quick that yes, Angela Lansbury in this film is chilling. She really should have, I think, probably won this category for me. It's just someone who, whenever she's on screen, she is just so captivating.
Yeah, absolutely no disrespect to the late great Patty Duke, who I have no problem with her Oscar, with her having an Oscar. I just really wish Angela Lansbury had won.
Yeah, because then also Angela Lansbury would have an Oscar.
Yeah.
And for such a role that people probably might not really associate with her, of just being like a Machiavellian villain. Ooh, yeah, love it. But we did get a question from Mark Brinkerhoff saying Angela Lansbury gives one of the greatest Best Supporting Actresses performance of all time, right up there with Monique. If the 1962 Oscars weren't rife with cases of category fraud, and then in parentheses, Badham, Duke, Terrence Stamp as the title character of Billy Budd, do you think she would have won?
Yes.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
Yes.
For sure, with this lineup.
Yeah. Nothing else to say there. Yes.
The answer is yes, sadly, because it's another case of a great legend not having a competitive Oscar. But yeah, those were all of the questions, but I also just want to mention Lolita here comes out from Stanley Kubrick. I think is a pretty good adaptation, not necessarily on the To Kill a Mockingbird level by any means for me, but is a good adaptation of that book. Yeah, and
that's daring. That is daring to do in 1962.
It is.
The fact that Kubrick even made films after making Lolita, you're just like, whoa.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and he would go on to make Doctor Strangelove right after this. So, yeah, very, it's a memorable story, Lolita. And I have to say, Shelley Winters in that, I think, was robbed of a nomination. I think she is so good at just kind of being a kind of character that Shelley Winters typically tends to play, of kind of the sort of bawdy woman who's kind of bossing people around and really knows what she wants. But I think she could have fit into this supporting actress race, no question, for me.
Agreed. Two other films I want to mention is John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which is one of my favorite Westerns. John Ford, I could go on and on about John Ford. I think I've seen close to every John Ford film ever made, and he made a lot of films.
Yeah.
So I'm a big fan of that one. Also, one that I think probably might have indirectly helped Gregory Peck is Cape Fear. The original Cape Fear with Robert Mitchum. That film, to me, is still to this day so much more effective than the Scorsese remake. because it really is this kind of film that you really didn't see in the 60s very often.
Right.
That kind of really, I mean, it is a straight up thriller that is just so gripping and wonderful. And Peck plays a completely different type of character. And it's also one of the great Robert Mitchum performances of just an absolute psychopath without resorting to a lot of the histrionics that De Niro does in the remake.
Fair enough. Nominated for that, I might add. But yes. I just wanted to quickly add in Jules and Jim, which is another great foreign language film from this year. Yeah, just one of those kind of indie types of films that I always can tend to love, about kind of a twisted love triangle. So that's always fun. Did you have any other films you wanted to mention here? You said you had like 15. I don't know if you've gotten to all of them.
Well, I'm a big fan of some of the other. I'm like, Sweet Bird of Youth, which won Best Supporting Actor for Ed Begley. I'm a big fan of that film, mainly because of my obsession with Geraldine Page.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also a really, really huge fan of the Light in the Piazza, which was kind of it's similarly it stars Olivia de Havilland, and it's the inspiration for the Broadway show of the same name. Big fan of that one too. So yeah, I mean, 62 was a great year for films. It's just amazing that more of these films didn't get into Best Picture.
Yeah, I would agree and say 62 was a great year, and it's you wouldn't know it from the Best Picture lineup.
Well, we also have to mention one more thing, and that is that 62 was the release of the first James Bond film, Dr. No.
Right. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned this. Yes, the beginning of a real legacy and really kind of a jump starting of what cinema would become with kind of franchise films. So, yes, that does happen in this year. Very good, Sean Connery. Yeah, I think that's the end of my list. So,
yeah,
very.
I think we've covered. Like, I think the moral of the story is pretty much any other 1962 release other than Mutiny on the Bounty, Longest Day, and well, no, Music Man, I'm okay with it.
I'll keep the Music Man.
Okay, so anything other than those two,
yeah,
they can go.
Yep. So, when we come back, we'll be delivering our verdict as to whether we think Lawrence of Arabia deserved Best Picture or if To Kill a Mockingbird should have taken it.
Tonight, we will give you a brief peek at scenes from those films nominated for Best Picture of 1962. They are Lawrence of Arabia, a Horizon Pictures Limited, Sam Spiegel, David Lean production, Columbia, produced by Sam Spiegel. The Longest Day, Darrell F. Zanuck Productions, 20th Century Fox, produced by Darrell F. Zanuck. Meredith Wilson's The Music Man, Warner Brothers, produced by Morton DaCosta. Mutiny on the Bounty, an Arcola production, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, produced by Aaron Rosenberg. To Kill a Mockingbird, a Universal International, Pakula, Mulligan, Brentwood production. Universal International, produced by Alan J. Pakula. The winner is Lawrence of Arabia, Sam Spiegel.
And we're back. So now we'll be delivering our verdict as to whether we think Lawrence of Arabia deserved Best Picture or if To Kill a Mockingbird really deserved it. Tony Ruiz, what is your verdict?
This is probably the hardest decision I've ever had of the 3 times I've been on this show.
Yeah.
And but I have to say, I have to go with Lawrence of Arabia. And it's not an easy decision for me to make, but it's breaking the mold of what the heroic epic is. It's absolutely groundbreaking, the groundbreaking way that it was created, has influenced pretty much every filmmaker of note since. And I just think it's one of those films that, is it dated in certain aspects, particularly in some of the casting? Yes.
Yeah.
But for the time period and as a story, as a script, on a technical level, it is a near perfect film. It is as perfect a film as I can think of.
Mm-hmm. I will co-sign that, even though I love To Kill a Mockingbird and I get so emotionally invested in it. I also have to acknowledge that Lawrence of Arabia is just on a completely other level, even compared to films made today. It's just so magnificent in its storytelling. That's the best word I can use to describe it. And like you said, just even if it's over 3 hours, almost 4 hours, it feels like every part of it is necessary to tell this epic, complex story of one of the most fascinating figures in history. So
I honestly think you can't call yourself a film lover without not just watching this film, but watching it repeatedly. Because
Sure.
I guarantee you, it's like a great book or a great piece of music. The more you watch it, the more you will discover. And I promise you, yes, it's almost 4 hours long. It doesn't feel that. It never feels that way. I've seen that film so many times, and I never feel like it lags, ever.
I will agree with that. Yeah, and that did surprise me. It always feels, like I said, like no scene is out of place. And I would love to see it on the big screen. I still haven't, but I know that they do
you
that
will
sometimes.
at some point. You will at some point, because
sure.
usually every 10 or 15 years they'll do like a special re-release of it.
Yeah.
I'm the first time I ever saw it on the big screen was just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I bet. Also, I just wanted to mention the music by Maurice Jarre there is timeless and gives me chills.
Yeah, it's one of those, music is such a, I don't think music always gets, particularly in contemporary cinema, I don't think music gets the respect it deserves. But also, you could do things with music in film that I wish more people were doing it the way the old masters did. Call me old-fashioned if you want to, but you just get lost in this score.
Completely agree. And that main theme is, whew, yeah. That's a good note to end on.
If you listen to that main theme and don't have the hair stand up, then
exactly.
You're missing a chromosome of some sort.
Yeah, and you can see why it's used in like all sorts of montages for like the amazing magic of movies.
Yeah, you've heard it before.
Yeah,
even if you've never
seen it.
Even if you think you haven't.
Right.
You have.
Right. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you, Tony. This was a very excellent chat. And covered some really fun films and some that did not deserve to be nominated for Best Picture, but certainly an interesting year once again. And I also have to mention that I found it to be an interesting pattern that it seems like whenever you're on the show, usually the runner-up you're talking about has like some sort of weird like trial or criminal element to it. Like we had Mystic River, right, and we had A Passage to India, and then we have this. It's just an interesting thing. Wow. I don't know if that's like a subconscious thing.
Maybe it comes from all my years of watching Perry Mason as a kid.
That's got to be it.
That just shows you what my tastes are.
Now we know. All right. Well, thank you again, Tony. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yes. So tell the people where they can find more of your work on the internet.
You can read my stuff at goldderby.com and follow me on Twitter at goldderbytony.
It's Emmy season.
It is Emmy season.
God help us all.
Yeah, Emmy nominations come out soon.
Yeah, actually, by the time this is posted, they will already have been out. So,
and Kevin and I will
yay and boo in advance.
We will, yes. So, a preview of our reactions. They nominated that. They didn't nominate that.
Huh? Yes, that's it. That's my entire reaction. It's just, huh? Okay. And you can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show is at Oscar Runner Up, and the podcast is everywhere you find podcasts, presumably. And you can also subscribe on Patreon if you want to hear even more stuff, including bonus episodes. And you can do that at patreon.com/andtherunnerup_is. Also, if you want to review the show, please do so at Apple Podcasts. So once again, thank you, Tony.
My pleasure, Kevin.
And I will bid you all adieu.